Good morning. Thank you very much for your time and for attending today. Myself and my colleagues from OPM wanted to present today about political economy analysis and look at some case studies of projects that we've done around effective government engagement. And I think throughout you can send in questions, and after the presentations we'll share some of the questions and I'll put it to my colleagues to answer. Next slide, please, Vinaya. Thank you. So really just to give a brief overview, we've got quite a short session, so we'll move through quite quickly. I'll start with a very brief introduction to political economy analysis. I'm sure a lot of you have come across it before, so we just wanted to highlight some of the key elements of it that are important for our work. And then we'll move into 3 case studies with colleagues who are joining on this call from different offices around the world. Thank you. Next slide, please, Vinay. Thanks. And so this is a very, very brief introduction. If you could go to the next slide, please, Vinay. Thank you very much. So we'll start with the really kind of basic stuff, just in case this is more of a new concept to some of you. And then I'll talk a little bit about sort of how it's evolved and how we're using it and how we're approaching it. So for us, political economy analysis is an approach, and it's about understanding power and resources and how they impact on incentives, drivers and barriers to change. And this is because our work is often looking to affect change, either in systems, processes and policies, and then ultimately impacts. And then the other dimension is that we think it's a process of applying our understanding of context, incentives and relationships. And I should also say learning. It's about applying what we're learning throughout a project as well. And that we're using that then to inform our project decision making and actions. And I want to talk a little bit about why we think this is useful and you know how it sort of looks in the way that we're applying it. So we wanted to really talk about the kind of work that we all do is sort of working with humans, and we're very complex and multifaceted. And we're also informed by different histories and environments and experiences. And we have different ideas and drives and incentives. And we often say, you know, we don't necessarily act rationally, but I think it goes even further in that, you know, what's deemed rational can actually differ according to different perspectives. And so when we're working with different people, we need to have a way in which we kind of understand and process and use this kind of knowledge and also seek to learn. And this is because, you know, I'm sure a lot of you will have had similar experiences to us, that what works on paper isn't necessarily what happens in practice, or very rarely what happens in practice. And then another challenge we sort of come across a lot is that there are, you know, short-term changes or opportunities, but they may not turn into long-term. And then also, I'm sure this has happened to many of us, myself definitely included, that there are occasions where there's difficulties engaging with particular clients or stakeholders, and that might be because of our own sort of misunderstandings or ignorance even about sensitive cultural historical factors, especially if they're unwritten. So we think this is why political economy analysis is useful. And I think we should, you know, highlight really that it is a very formal acronym and it is sort of seen as a technical term. But we think there's no set way of doing political economy analysis. And really the way you do it has to be about the way in which it's most useful for your project and for your goals. And we're using the words process and approach really deliberately because we don't think it's really about the tools that you use, although we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's also about how it's used to shape the team's planning and learning and then behaviours to give projects the best possible chance of success and then impact as well. Next slide, please, Vinay. After saying that, you know, there's no set way of doing things and no tools, we did want to highlight some really concrete sort of areas that we think political economy analysis can contribute to. So around, you know, program design, especially, and understanding that history is really key. Certainly in terms of advocacy and influencing and theory of change, and especially stakeholder engagement and research uptake. And we want to talk a little bit about this later, but I really wanted to sort of highlight, I guess, the background behind why we think this is helpful, and also helpful to do it consciously. So, you know, many of you, I'm sure, and we all do a form of political economy analysis informally. It's, you know, about tacit knowledge, it's about reading the room, and it might also and often come from informal conversations with stakeholders and colleagues, which will then implicitly inform ideas and actions. But we think it is valuable to do, you know, conscious political economy analysis as well. And that's because, you know, it can feed into these sort of concrete pieces, which can help shape projects and decisions across a team. And this, you know, it might sort of influence, you know, who's part of a training session or when's best to publish a policy brief and that kind of thing. And so thinking it through in the context of what you're trying to deliver, we think is helpful for thinking about where impact comes from, and then also who impact comes from, or who messages come from for that impact as well. And then I think, as well as sort of being able to share information with colleagues and think about it more actively and formally, I think one of the elements we don't talk about a lot in political economy analysis, but we also think is important, is being aware then of our own position and impact within, you know, the environment and within the history, which will then impact on our projects as well. And then I think it's also then important to think about our role, and then how the sort of the way in which we act and the way in which we decide what to do is informed then by the political economy and our role in it. So we may want to consider sort of particular actions, such as, you know, working with the grain to have some impact, but then also understanding our role in reinforcing or reproducing, say, inequalities. So doing a political economy analysis can help us think through, you know, components such as Jessie, so that we ensure that marginalised groups can be integrated, and that we don't just focus on actors who seem to be powerful. And next slide, please. We just wanted to make a quick mention of sort of the context dimension and the evolution of political economy. So it started really as a sort of report at the beginning of a project, but actually what we think the value comes from is the process by which the team goes through when gathering. So gathering information and then using it to make decisions. And this is why we're talking about the shift to approach and process. And there are a couple of sort of approaches which might be of interest, and this is what we're going to go into in the case studies, but thinking and working politically, and problem-driven political economy analysis, and really asking those questions to help the programs evolve and to help the teams learn. And then next slide, please, Vinaya. Thank you. And then the final bit we wanted to talk a little bit about was through sort of frameworks, and this is the problem-driven political economy analysis. This came from a really interesting paper recently. We've put the source there. Hopefully it can be shared so people can pick up the paper as well. And I won't go into this too much because we want to go into the case studies, but we really wanted to highlight the importance of understanding actors and stakeholders in political economy analysis as well. And this is because people at the end of the day are often the drivers of change. They can also be the obstacles to change, which you'll see and hear about in the case studies presented today. But we really just wanted to highlight the fact that actors and stakeholders are a really key part of this understanding as well. And then next slide, please, Vinay. Thank you. So I just wanted to briefly introduce the case studies. Firstly, we'll have my colleague Majib, who is going to talk about a program in Pakistan. We'll then move on to Ken, who's talking about a program in Nigeria. And finally, we're going to have a talk from Radhika, who's going to talk about a global study, but that goes into a different dimension of PEA, which is about strengthening evidence. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Majid now.
Thank you, Eleanor. If you could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the case study, as Eleanor mentioned, is about a subsidy, a per subsidy in the Punjab province of Pakistan, and the political economy management around that, and the way the team worked, thinking and working politically, try to bring in the reform. If we could move to the next slide, please. So a bit about the context of the subnational governance program. SNG is an FCDO funded program which supports the provinces of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Punjab in Pakistan to bring about governance reforms through strengthened planning, PFM, and revenue enhancement measures. If you could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, once more. Thank you. So the context that the SNG works in is both complex and turbulent. I mean, the so-called elite bargain is not yet settled, with the shape of the federation still evolving. Political volatility can be gauged from the fact that 3 political administrations changed hands in just 12 months in 2 of the 3 jurisdictions that we work in. We also work in the federal government level, so that's the 3rd jurisdiction. And a sustained financial distress has meant that Pakistan needed to go to the IMF for its 24th bailout package. And the poverty has been on the rise, not least because of the recent monstrous floods that inundated 1/3 of Pakistan, area roughly the size of Great Britain. And its civil service is in a crunch. And that's the element that our teams regularly work with. They essentially have been in a sense on the retreat, and their objectivity under stress through highly insecure tenures. Often it's less than a year, and in some cases it's as low as 3 months. Next slide, please. So now a bit about the case study. So let me briefly share an overview of the process and the stakeholders involved in the wheat subsidy management. First of all, at the beginning of the year, around the time of the harvest, the government sets the purchase price of wheat, which the farmers and the rural politicians particularly, and some elements within the food department want to influence and want to keep it as high as possible. The food department then procures wheat using short-term commercial finance, also bear storage costs, and then going into the year, it sets the release price somewhere around October. That is when the flour mills, the urban politician, and again some elements within the food department lobby for that release price to be set as low as they can, as possible. This push for higher purchase price and a pull for a lower release price combined to create an unfunded part of the transaction that is filled by the government budget, which is essentially the wheat subsidy. And the entire management of this operation is actually off budget through a separate account called Account 2. More importantly, the subsidy is not targeted. So the cheap wheat flour is available to all, rich and poor included. And this has gone on for decades. Next slide, please. The consequences have been perilous, as the 2 graphs on the right-hand side would show. The persistent differential in the purchase and release price of around 23% has meant that the cumulative subsidy-related debt in fiscal 2022 amounted to £2 billion, which equaled 22% of the provincial budget. Unaddressed by 2024, this would have ballooned to 35% of the provincial budget. And the annual interest payment alone comes to about £630 million. And the physical commodity backup is only to the extent of 40%. It used to be somewhere in the region of 80-85%. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So the reform proposal that the program supported included reducing the procurement volume to strategic reserves, eliminating the price mismatch between the purchase and the release prices, retiring the debt, and designing a targeted social protection plan to shield those affected by the elimination of the subsidy. And the plan was finally approved by the provincial cabinet in fiscal 2022. Next slide, please. So the impact has been huge, with the subsidy-related debt coming down by 77% from what it would have been by fiscal 2024. The interest rate came down from the Karachi Interbank offer rate plus 300 basis points to actually plus 10 basis points. It literally collapsed, with the stranglehold of the banks now effectively shaken off. The foregone subsidy expense and the markup savings in just 1 year amounted to over 800 million pounds. It's about close to $1 billion. The remaining debt is now fully backed by the commodity stock. If you could move to the next slide, please. But how did we do it? I mean, we use local consultants, teams of local consultants who are adept at thinking and working politically, and they work as trusted advisors with the government counterparts. And a trusted advisor is someone who has a deep understanding of the context. It has extensive network of contacts, and in some cases is a former colleague of the counterparts that he or she works with. I mean, because of their valuable role, they often are door openers and are relied upon by the government, for advice too. So, shall we move to the next slide, please? Once more. Thank you. So knowing the stakeholders and incentives was critical for this intervention. As I explained, the farmer and the rural politician in this case, it's the upper left-hand quadrant, wanted a higher purchase price. And the flour mills and the urban politician now, who have different constituents, which is represented by the lower right-hand quadrant, wanted the price to be set as low as possible, with the banks essentially benefiting from this difference. And as long as this charade continued, their game was on, because there was a mismatch, there was a gap, and loans were needed. The SNG team literally uncovered the decoupling within the government. The food department literally working on either side of the fence, and the central intent of the government behind this operation virtually going missing. Shall we move to the next slide, please? The chances of bringing about change in this collusive environment was very slim, and it needed an influential outsider to shake things up. The team used their networks and skillful advocacy to win over the finance department. Click please once more. And the chief secretary, and who decided to enter the fray and agreed to question the whole issue. Let's move to the next slide, please. So the team used their deep access and went and collected scattered food department data, did the analysis and built a picture that was not present, of course. And at the same time, it brought into light the hitherto obscure account 2 that I referred to earlier, which essentially were off budget and often hidden from the oversight of the central finance department, despite there being a government guarantee on commodity loans. So if you could click once more, so the power shift was now visible, moving more towards the finance department and the chief secretary because of this disclosure and sharing of knowledge. Let's move to the next slide, please. On the procurement, on the purchase price, since it was supported by the rural politician and the farmer, thank you, Pooja. So it needed some incentivization for behavior change. So the team then worked with the government to devise a targeted input subsidy, a targeted input subsidy for agriculture farmers, which essentially neutralized any crib that the rural politician had, and they simply backed off. If you could click, then I think the rural politician should disappear. Once more, please. Once more. Yes, thank you. So with the rural politician gone, the purchase price pressure on that had been eliminated, and now the team worked with the lower right-hand quadrant, and then they again assisted the department in designing a social protection program that was there to protect those, to shield those who would be affected by removing the wheat subsidy. This essentially meant that the urban politician did not have a serious interest in supporting a lower release price. If you could click, and once more, and the urban politician should also vanish from the scheme of things. And finally, the team, yes, one more click, please. Yes. So the team did a very crucial analysis of the loans rollover data, because the loans are typically, these are short-term loans and rolled over every 3 months. And they identified patterns. For instance, the banks would use this loan rollover opportunity to actually hedge their risks ahead of the policy rate announcement by the central bank. So, I mean, that was a collusive situation going on. And the banks would make a joint bid and dividing the pie between themselves. So on advice, government actually banned the banking consortia, and that actually literally led to the collapse of the interest rates, which, as I said, came down from 300 basis points to 10 basis points about Karachi interbank offer rate. If you could click, if you could click, please. Sorry, can you hear me? Yes, and one more. Okay, thanks. Yes, thank you. So in terms of the outcome of this thinking and working politically approach, there has been a major governance reform with multiple benefits. Price differential has melted away. In fact, the government is literally exiting from the commercial commodity operations beyond the need to maintain strategic reserves. All unsecured debt has been liquidated, and any remaining commodity operations will now be on budget as against earlier being off budget. SNG will be supporting this reform in the coming year. And the cartelization of the bank is also finally over. Shall we move to the next slide? And this is the final slide. So in terms of key takeaways, for a program intervention, one only needs most of the time informal nested PAs on the back of a formal big PA, which typically happens in the beginning of the program, and you don't need to redo that again and again, and then assess which of the key battles to fight. This approach in another situation helped us advise the funder to actually not engage on a seemingly promising reform area, and it subsequently unraveled further down the road. So this is an important piece, the insight that comes from these nested PAs and with teams thinking and working in a politically agile manner. And it's equally important to fully understand the problem and the underlying factors, that prohibit the reform, and understand who the key stakeholders are, what their interests are, and what motivates them. Likewise, the timing is also crucial. In this particular case, for instance, we identified the wheat subsidy as a target reform area, and there was actually a resistance from the funder initially because of the adverse political economy. They asked us actually not to venture into this, but suddenly we realized the situation had become more conducive. We had supported the provincial government on fiscal risk policy reforms. And then there was an opportunity when funds became available. We put the two together and suggested that they could actually proceed with reforming the subsidy, and money was available to retire a big chunk of reforms. Similarly, smart data use and strategic communication help bring on-side, powerful stakeholders. But behind all this is the role of the trusted advisor that our teams essentially are, with deep access and network of contacts. But in the end, I'd like to make a particular point about the centrality of center of government, i.e. the leverage that comes from working with the center of government, the powerful ministries of finance and planning, which helps get results more effectively than one is working with line ministries. And this is a particular insight and actually helped dismantle this subsidy, perverse subsidy. So that is it. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take questions at the end when other presentations have been done. Thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everyone. So I'll be talking about a case study from Nigeria using one of the projects we implemented, and essentially looking at how we leverage PEA for effective government engagement. Next slide, please. So Nigeria is an amazing country, blessed with abundant natural resources. However, like every country in the world, there are its development is always underpinned by several factors. In the case of Nigeria, one of the critical things would be it has an extremely large population, and that population is also growing. Population growth rate is about 3.75 at the last count. It also has a large rate of urbanization and changing use of land across. As I said, it's a resource-rich country. And that is also set with a few macroeconomic challenges and some policy choices which have been challenging. One of the greatest paradoxes in Nigeria is that it's a resource-rich country, as I've said, but it's also has significant levels of poverty. There are quite a few bottlenecks to inclusive growth. There are issues with inflation, and our economy really has been dependent on oil production. And unfortunately, when there are challenges, both technical or the sort of geopolitics of energy where demand and supply are not balanced, then if there's a decline, either in the production or in the demand, then the revenue that comes into the government is obviously reduced, and that translates to less benefits for the citizenry. And this is all framed in the context of the need to move towards a just energy transition and cleaner sources of energy, so renewables. And as well, Nigeria has a large gas deposit, which is seen as a transition fuel. And these are all to sort of mitigate climate change impact. So that's the context. And I'm framing this context between 2011 and 2023, which is the sort of locus of where the project I'm going to describe was being implemented. Next slide, please. So quite briefly, I'll just talk about what the project was called. It's the Facility for Oil Sector Transformation. It was an oil sector governance project funded by the UK government, various iterations of the Agency for International Development, from the DFID to UKAID to the current iteration, which is the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. In terms of the project itself, FOSTA, that's the acronym. It spanned 12 years, about 2011 to 2023, circa £32 million. And towards the tail end of the project, the focus was now moved towards the reduction of emissions from the oil and gas sector, so more around the climate angle of the oil and gas sector. Next slide, please. So I'll talk quite briefly about the approach. I think the essence of this presentation is not really to talk about the program in its sense, but it's to show how political economy and thinking and working politically are enshrined in delivering development and actually making an impact. So in the case of FOSTA, there were basically the two sides of the coin. The first side is the supply side, and the supply side would be the government and the agencies that deliver interventions and oversee oil extraction and downstream, which is sort of like going into a petrol station and buying gas. All that is managed by the government and in collaboration with the private sector. So that's more or less the supply side. So in the program's design, we focused on technical assistance to those reformers and those agencies within government to sort of make the sector more accountable, more efficient, and more transparent. So that's handling the supply. But on the other side, there's also a need for a high level of accountability, and that accountability is sort of the demand. So those people who require these services, they should know what is the sector, what happens in the sector, what are the issues, and they need to be able to actually demand for reforms to make sure that their revenues and the services are of the quality that they deserve. So we focused on working with the media, civil society, and other accountability organizations. Next slide, please. So in terms of thinking and working politically, I mean, every project, from the agriculture projects, water projects, education, all that. I mean, a project looking at family planning or smallholder farmers will think and work politically. So I think the issue is that they would always use diverse tools to do this analysis and deliver their programs. I think the most important thing is that there has to be an emphasis on working with knowledge and a local context to deliver all the interventions. Next slide, please. So the three major factors I would say that are important. One is the external dynamics. What's the context of the project? Who are the partners? What relationships exist? The second element will be the internal dynamics. Who does the project have as their staff? Who are the consultants who can actually deliver technical advisory for the project? That's critical. And the third element is, how do you apply political economy analysis, and how's that done? And in the case of Foster, it was a large, nimble, reactive, and quite complex project dealing on an issue which was quite difficult for a lot of reasons. Next slide, please. So I would just talk briefly about some of the issues in the oil and gas sector at the time. There was an issue of transparency. There was an issue with the high burden of fuel subsidies, where the government was paying a lot of money to make sure petrol was a lot cheaper. And in the end, other essential services were suffering. There was conflicts in certain regions where oil extraction was happening, and that's from various failures in terms of property rights, revenue sharing, and all that. There was also the climate impacts, where gas flaring and oil spills were also an issue. But I think I would use one case study, which would be the policy framework. There was an outdated 1969 petroleum industry legislation that was in play, and that's what we felt would, if that was focused on, that would address the other issues. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Petroleum Industry Act, it was to provide the governance, regulatory, and fiscal framework for the sector. And the passage was something that we focused on in the project. Next slide, please. Yeah, it took over 20 years before it was eventually passed in 2021. So it was quite difficult, several cycles of parliament, issues with revenues and all that. So it was an essential process. Next slide. And what we learned was that there is not always a best fit. You know, you would look at, should we model against Norway? Should we model against the US? Sometimes best practice might not be possible. And then you might have to look at what's the best fit for the situation. And that's what we did. We also needed to know who would be the winners and losers for any sort of reform in terms of the Petroleum Industry Act, who benefits, who had the sort of local ownership and the implementation pathways if we were able to work with the government to get an industry act passed by the parliament. So these were the sort of issues that were looked at as from a political economy lens. Next slide, please. Presenting information in the right way was always key. I mean, the subsidy, as I mentioned, was a huge amount, but just telling people that you could have built 2,400 hospitals, you could have built 500,000 houses, educated 2 million people, you now realize that, right, this is something that you need to act on as a policymaker. So we use that as a strategy, and it was very effective. The picture on the right is also showing that gas flaring occurs very close to where people have the economic activity, and that's also very, very important to consider. Next slide, please. So I think the final slide is really going back to those 3 points I mentioned at the beginning. In terms of the external dynamics, I think Mujib also mentioned it. Being a trusted advisor, in our case, what we were called was an honest broker. Very, very important. People need to trust you for you to be able to get information and to be able to do political economy efficiently. You need to also focus on people who make up the institutions, not just the institutions themselves, strategically going with the grain, or depending on how the context is, going against the grain. You need to understand who has the power, what's the context. In terms of the internal dynamics, I'm a massive advocate for localization and using locally led skills supported by international best practice and global teams, but local teams with the context and the contacts are very, very essential. TA must be feasible and politically sound. Capabilities must be aligned to be responsive and adaptive. And then always know where's the next crisis, what's going to happen in the sector, what are the important things that you need to think about. And I think in terms of the PEA design, PEA is an everyday activity. You need to basically have milestone PEA events, but it's in your planning, it must be used and integrated. And essentially, I think it has to be validated across multiple stakeholders. Some of the most valuable information we got from our PEA was actually just from triangulating the information across multiple stakeholders. And I think when you put all this together, you have a program and an intervention that is sort of based on a sound footing, and you're able to actually deliver the impact that you have set out to do. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Ken. Moving on to the next case study. So I'll be speaking about a program that we worked on, strengthening evidence use for development impact, and how we integrated PEA in the design and management of a very complex program. Next slide, please. So SEDI was funded by FCDO in the UK. We worked with the government and governments in Pakistan, Uganda, and Ghana to promote innovation and capacity development for evidence-informed decision-making. What we were aiming for was to increase the instrumental use of evidence in decision-making, but more importantly, to embed the use of evidence in systems, processes, and the working culture of government. Next slide, please. So we went on to develop something that was called the PA Plus framework. And why did we do that? So SEDI built on a predecessor program called BCure, which focused on capacity development for evidence use within government. But the big lesson learned from that was just focusing on capacity development without looking at the political spaces of change doesn't get us very far. So this framework was developed to identify, what are those entry points? Where are the political spaces for change? And specifically for SEDI, we were given a few sectors. So, gender, family planning, humanitarian assistance in Uganda, economic development, vocational education, child labor in Pakistan. So we had to choose, which sector we would work on based on, political economy analysis. I saw a question in the chat about how we've drawn on ODI's work. So this was a consortium that managed this program. ODI, INASP, TIE, and OPM were the international partners in this consortium, and we had national partners, SDPI, ASSET, and EPRC. So we drew on all of the learning from these organizations to develop this framework. Really, I think building on the work that's been going on thinking and working politically. Next slide, please. So this is the framework that we developed for the program. It's called PA Plus for a reason. There are 3 overlapping lenses, and actually 4 if you add Jesse in. So one looking at the drawing on classic political economy models, the foundational structural factors, rules of the game, stakeholders, looking at taking a very macro and sectoral perspective, but then also adding an evidence lens, because we're looking at evidence use in this case. So evidence in this case was defined as qualitative, quantitative research, monitoring data, statistics, evaluation, citizen data. So what is the ecosystem of players? What are the sort of dynamics in evidence generation? What kind of evidence is considered credible? But then also adding an organizational lens. So within the government, which are the ministries and which are the units where there is what we call AAA, the ability to carry out change, the acceptance of change, and the authority to do things. So with that, we also took on a Jesse lens. So I think very often when you do PA, you're always looking at the powerful. So what does it look like for the marginalized? How are policies targeted at them? How is evidence used? Who's missing in the evidence? And we did this to identify, as I said, the entry points. Where are the spaces for change? Next slide, please. I won't get into too much of the findings because you can visit our website for that. But by and large, there were variations across sectors and patterns seen across sectors. It was clear that in certain sectors, there are very powerful forces at work. For example, religious groups dominated the conversation on family planning in Uganda, and it was it was a highly political issue. So we really need to be careful as to how we manage that. Similarly, child labor was not high priority in Pakistan because it had the support of elites. But a lot of interesting information on institutional structures and how that works. So an M&E directorate, which is under the Office of the Prime Minister, is far more powerful in generating and using evidence than a separate ministry that doesn't have that authorization from the Prime Minister, as was the case in Ghana, for example. But then I think the organizational lens was really helpful to get a sense of what are those capacity-related issues, the technical issues, and within capacity, what is it? Is it skills that is a problem? Is it the number of staff? A number of issues like that. Next slide, please. But COVID hit, so we were caught unawares. We were supposed to be, working in specific sectors, but we had to then use all of this political intelligence to think about, okay, how do we pivot the program? We had built good relationships with the governments. We were working through the PA exercise. We had already identified a few who really were, on board, the champions, as they would say, who wanted to, think about change strategies. Next slide, please. So we then decided that we needed an approach. I mean, this was very in-depth sort of PA that we carried out in the first phase. We needed something that was, for the PA plus analysis, we had done stakeholder interviews, we had done lots of literature reviews, we had produced reports, but now we needed something really quick because COVID-19 was changing political realities very, very quickly. So we adopted this method called the PA refresh, which was something that was really very ongoing. So we maintained learning diaries when we were able to collect, information from our meetings. We were monitoring the media. Every 6 months, we did a survey with key stakeholders. In some context, surveys didn't work, so we did interviews with a few key stakeholders. But more importantly, all of this political intelligence was used to sort of come together as a program team, reflect on, what are we learning from this and what do we need to do and how do we sort of reposition ourselves and how do we sort of make strategic choices for the program. Next slide, please. So what we did was we then started integrating it in also the work that we were doing. So we carried out what we call these organizational diagnostics in Uganda and Pakistan. So PA Plus was then integrated in the framework that was used. So we drew on INASP's context matters to carry out these organizational diagnostics. They look at organizations, a real deep dive looking at capacity, culture, management processes. But bringing in PA Plus actually helped us deliberate on, what are those political questions that we may be missing. Next slide, please. So just to end with an example of a diagnostic exercise we carried out in Pakistan, this was with the National Tariff Commission. And, what PA Plus was really helpful for was to have those really frank conversations on, what are those political challenges, technical challenges, legal challenges related to evidence use. So NTC was really keen to improve the generation of and use of evidence. And the staff reported, for example, that there's low trust in external stakeholders, that, public procurement is a challenge, so they can't rapidly commission someone to produce evidence. And so that really helped us think with them about what are the feasible change strategies. It's then better for them to sort of set up an in-house unit, increase capacity within NTC. So they decided then to set up, a center of excellence, to build their survey capacity and research capacity. But very importantly, I think we introduced some of the GESI-related questions. So initially, the conversations were about gender and trade reform, and they saw it as a very gender-neutral space. But then when we started talking about, evidence related to gender, the gender-related barriers in trade reform, I think it really started to open out, alternative views. And I think this was a start to changes. Change may not have happened immediately, but it was a start to a shift in thinking. Next slide, please. So just to end, this case study to say that, this example of how we integrated PEA shows how versatile and important PEA is. It can be in-depth, it can be also light touch and very ongoing, and it can inform program design, management, and actually, helped us develop very politically smart interventions. It was helpful for us to identify entry points, which are the organizations we could work with, who we could work with, what we could work on, how we could work with them, but also think through feasible change strategies together. It's really important to tailor PEA to our objectives and the changing context. I think COVID-19 showed that. But very importantly, I think the contribution of the PEA Plus framework is the introduction of the organizational lens. So when you are working with organizations, unpacking what the AAA is, the ability, authority, acceptance of change, what does capacity mean, unpacking all of that, right? And then importantly, introducing, I've added the D here, disability, gender, equity, disability, social inclusion, to ask some of those difficult questions, because it helps surface, who is visible, who is invisible, because with PEA, you often look at the powerful and you need to bring the conversations, you need to center the conversations on the marginalized as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Radhika and Ken and Majid, and thank you to everyone sending in really interesting questions. I know myself and colleagues have been trying to write and answer some of those. I think my colleague Pooja is going to put in some email contacts as well if you want to follow up, because I don't know if we can cover all of the questions here. I think Majid has answered that interesting question about the role of trusted advisor and project champion. So hopefully you can all see that. I wonder if I could address the first question then to Ken, or a couple of questions actually, if that's okay, that have come through. One is hopefully a quick one around to what extent Foster worked with the ITI and civil society network and member organizations. And then the other question, which is really current, super interesting, is around whether the PA included analysis on misinformation and how that influenced perceptions of the reform. It would be, great to hear a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. Yeah, I just tried to respond to that on the chat, but I think super interesting questions. On the first one on the EITI, yes, they were, the Nigerian EITI variant, NATI, was a major partner for Foster because their role in terms of both being quasi-government, but their role in terms of being able to look at things like audit reports, their relationships with civil society, and some technical ability to address issues around revenue management. So they made us, they made one of the most credible partners that we worked with. We looked at things like beneficial ownership and contract transparency. So it was, in fact, our EITI, the support with throughout the life of the program was basically one of the first things we would do on our work plan. So it was a very, very good partnership. The second question is also super interesting. And it's about misinformation. And I think that's quite something that needs to always be looked at in terms of any reform. So it could be addressed in two ways. And that's what we did in terms of, first of all, how are people getting information? We did our initial analysis and we found out that most of the journalists in the, both on the print side and the electronic side, before the advent of, social media, because if you remember, the project started in 2011, to where people would get news from the radio or newspapers. A lot of them didn't have the content and the context of the oil and gas sector. So as a strategy, we needed to sort of provide a lot of that information. And then using stakeholder engagement focus groups, we started finding out what were the misconceptions, what would people think about the issues. A simple issue is around the petrol subsidy. It benefits when people buy petrol at a cheaper cost. It seems like an immediate benefit, but people don't understand potentially that it's actually affecting other essential services like healthcare and the ability for the government to invest in infrastructure because it's a huge resource burden. So being able to understand those misconceptions through PEA and engagements, we would now be able to sort of counter, but also enlighten people in terms of these are the facts, and the strategy was really effective, and we would need to do that consistently over the life of the program. So yeah, really an excellent question, and one of our major strategies that we realized that it would be something that we would need to do over the life of the program. I hope that addresses the questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was super interesting, and thank you to the person who asked that question as well, because that's really relevant. And I'm definitely going to ask Ken to talk about that within OPM as well. We'll just say, there's lots more to discuss, I'm sure. For anyone who's in the centre and meeting people, there is the OPM stand, and Pooja and Ken is there, and Vinaya there. So please do go through to the exhibit hall if you want to connect with them and ask more questions in person, and also really happy to connect over email. And just to say a huge thank you to everybody, both the speakers and the organisers, and of course to you for joining as well. And we hope you have a good rest of the day and rest of the conference as well. Thank you very much.